and we'll go from there. All right. Hello, everyone. It's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So, guys, I hope everyone is doing okay. I have with me journalist, formerly of TYT. I always get caught with that. Let's try this one more time. I have with me journalist extraordinaire Michael Tracey. He's formerly of TYT, formerly of Vice News. Michael Tracey, what's going on?
Not much, sir. How about you?
Things are well. Like I said before I started, I wanted to thank you again for coming on. I was giving you somewhat of a kudos because like I said, you've been, I want to say antagonistic towards the Russia thing, but done so in a sane way, essentially pushing back on the narrative itself. And so I wanted to thank you for it because you've been somewhat of what I consider to be a voice of sanity in what has been, I would describe as hysteria. So what is your take on this? So, Mueller's come out with the 13 Russians, and then you have this other thing that's been going on for 2 years now, where they've been discussing this case, not necessarily been able to find the smoking gun for anything, but screaming about it nonetheless. What is your take on just an overall first, but lastly on the indictments, these last indictments that Mueller has put out or pulled out of the apolitical Mueller has pulled out just before Trump was supposed to meet with Vladimir Putin?
Well, I appreciate the kudos. Like I mentioned off air, I think there's something of a personality quirk within me where even though I have a wide range of journalistic interests, it seems as though that this particular issue has been so dominant and the popular portrayal of has been so conformist that I almost feel as though there's an obligation for me to do what I can to use the platform that I have to provide an alternative view. And it's not to overstate the influence that I have, which is probably not that great, but for whatever influence I do have, I want to use it to that end. Although, like I mentioned, I'd probably be just as happy, going back in a time machine to like 3 years ago and be able to cover, surveillance policy, drug policy, all the stuff that used to be on my reportorial docket until 2016. But since 2016, we've all seemed to be kind of stuck in this time warp where we can't escape that one night in November. And everything going on now is still, bizarrely enough, still kind of an offshoot of that. So it's just sort of a weird set of political circumstances. But going to the indictments and the latest developments, I think first it's worth clarifying something, because this, I think, gets lost in a lot of the uproar around this issue when it's kind of just discussed on a day-to-day basis. There is a right-wing narrative about Mueller and about Trump and about the broader Russia issue that is reductive and that does neglect some of the more important kind of pillars of the argument as far as I could see them. So I don't think that it's mutually exclusive to be putting forth this version of events as I see it, and also saying that the popular right-wing media portrayal is warped in a lot of ways. Like Sean Hannity is not the font of wisdom just because at times he's sounding similar notes to what I or other people might say with regard to the Russia investigation. And for that matter, neither is Donald Trump. So they tend to dwell on this notion of a deep state conspiracy. And while the deep state is a concept that is amply documented, might not always be characterized in that precise term. The idea that the overriding interest of the entire monolithic deep state is to frame Trump, I think, is, again, an oversimplification. And, it's such a complex issue that it's even difficult to summarize right now. Yeah. But just the bottom line is you can be wary both of the official mainstream media propagated narrative and also like the right-wing propagated narrative. So anyway, put that aside. The Mueller indictments on Friday.
Wait, hold on. I like that you said that, by the way, the narratives, because ultimately what we're talking about is just narratives. I think sometimes media comes across sometimes as the word of God. You know what I mean? It's like people, you look at it, you have this guy with an awesome suit on, and with that awesome suit on, he's telling you what is taking place from this godlike perspective of events. That's his story. That's his narrative. That's the way he's looking at particular events that have taken place in the world and organizing them in a way and saying, all right, this is the way I think of this. Here you are. Well,
and you know,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. You know why narrative is so crucial with respect to this issue in particular? It's because there's such a high volume of information coming out day after day that it's impossible for ordinary people to follow it with anything close to regularity. For that matter, it's impossible for professional journalists to follow it most of the time. For people who are paid to follow the news, I hear from them constantly that even they feel overwhelmed by the amount of information coming at them constantly. Yeah. So that's why narrative plays such a significant role here, is because you have to take together disparate facts and weave them in furtherance of a certain, narrative kind of structure. Because otherwise there's no way to process the sheer volume of information that's constantly barraging everybody. So that's why I brought the narrative point up, and I think that's
Well, I think people follow it in that way. I think when people process it, I don't think I don't know how people outside of a bubble particularly look at that stuff, but I imagine they look at it in the way my mom looks at politics. She sees something in the news, she hears something. Okay, this person is a bad guy. I give an example, like Vladimir Putin. She would say Vladimir Putin is a bad guy, and I said, well, why do you think he's a bad guy? Not saying he is or not, but why do you think he's a bad guy? Because I know she doesn't follow the news. So why do you have this particular thought in your head? And she says, well, I remember him during the time when he used to be under Yeltsin. Right. Do you know what happened to Yeltsin? Do you know how Yeltsin got in office? And then you start kind of going down this rabbit hole. If you understand that we were instrumental in, assisting them and literally intervening into their politics in order to get Yeltsin in, come to find out we had Putin that was kind of behind the scenes. But I was trying to get the point to her that the reason why you think he's a bad guy to some degree is because the media has told you he's a bad guy. You've accepted a particular narrative without having the underlying understanding of the things associated to build the narrative. Does that make sense? Like, it's like the narrative gets it becomes important because I don't think people follow the specific details. They follow a story about it.
Yeah, and the Russia issue is like a multiplicity of like 1,000 different interconnected issues.
Yes.
So you have everything from international diplomacy to Syria to domestic politics to Trump's business ties to what Putin is doing to. I mean, it never ends. It's hard to unspool it all. So because it's. And I think it's almost unique in American history for being such an unwieldy narrative that is so unconfined by any kind of like typical narrative boundaries.
Yeah.
That's why I don't even think it's necessarily unreasonable for your mom or somebody else who's not a devoted news consumer, and most people who are sane probably are not, to just a way to give them a means of just processing information in a manner that makes sense to them, to kind of latch onto these narrative structures that have been propagated by people in the media in whom they had pre-existing trust. The issue is that those people have proven that they're not trustworthy. Yeah. But just in general, the average person is rational if he or she says, I have a life, I have a family, I have a job, I have everything else going on. Therefore, I'm gonna select a couple of people who are paid to follow this stuff, all day, and who I have granted some legitimacy. I'm going to rely on them to give me an informed narrative version of what is happening here. It's just the problem is that those people have constructed a narrative that is fundamentally flawed. So there's a ton of information and a ton of skewed perception going on now.
I look at this and I think to myself, I thought everyone had a dog in the hunt. It's from the standpoint of media and politics. I looked at it as the party itself hated Donald Trump's gut, and they were going to latch on to anything to explain why Hillary Clinton failed. And so I look at it as, Trump and Russia became this kind of thing that they could kind of latch on to in order to push this narrative that she didn't fail on her own merits. And Donald Trump is any particular political party would do it. Republicans did it with Benghazi. Oh my God, Benghazi. All of them, Bill Clinton and, whatever they can stick on Bill Clinton, all political parties do it. With Trump, it has just jumped the shark magnificently to like insane lunatic proportions. I was listening to an interview. It was a debate between Glenn Greenwald and this other guy who's working to try to get rid of nukes. the guy is hysterical. I mean, the stuff he's saying, they're acting like this is a war. It's what is your take on this? So I look, you're a journalist. Is it me, or have journalistic standards been thrown out the window on this particular issue?
Oh, journalistic standards have been completely thrown, not just out the window, but like out the window into the dumpster, and then the dumpster was set on fire. You know, there's example after example, to the point that listing them almost feels tedious at this point. You know, of people who are so desperate to cling on to some tidbit of information which would seem to further the Russia narrative, that they don't apply the same journalistic standards that they would ordinarily, because they feel that there's some kind of patriotic obligation to get it out there. And I have to mention one example.
Maybe that's what it is. Okay, go ahead.
And there's, well, I mean, that's one reason for it. Another, I mean, one that I have to mention.
But that's a damn good reason. Like, that's a damn good because media tends to be obsequious in times of war. Like, they tend to essentially toe the government line. And if the government is making this argument that we've been attacked, then media has, I think there's a fiscal incentive in doing it, but also this kind of patriotic thing.
Yeah, and actually the patriotic justification is something that's been invoked recently by Marcy Wheeler, whose work over the years I've really respected. She's a brilliant person, I think. She's very voluminous in the amount of documentation and information that she's able to compile. You know, you may have seen her Empty Wheel Twitter and blog. I mean, she's just been a very valuable resource over the years. And yet, you know, last week or a week and a half ago or something, she came out with this really blockbuster bombshell post in which she admitted that she had approached the FBI with information regarding one of her sources that approached her in confidence shortly after the election in 2016.
What?
And she said that she felt she had a patriotic obligation to basically betray this source in the most egregious. She didn't just out the source. She gave the FBI information about the source. It's like the worst possible cardinal sin of journalism. And maybe in some bizarre universe that's justified because of some extraordinary set of circumstances that she hasn't revealed yet. But, you know, on paper, if you just look at what she's divulged thus far, that is one of the most just unbelievable journalistic betrayals that you could ever commit. And yet she was celebrated for doing this. She was touted as almost a hero. And you know, I don't want to condemn her necessarily. I don't have all the information. I'm just saying, given what she's publicly presented thus far, it raises extremely grave concerns about her course of action here. Yeah. And yet, because people were so invested in, again, this certain narrative, they looked at what she did and actually celebrated for it. They didn't even contemplate that it was a potential compromising of journalistic ethics to a spectacularly egregious degree. So that's just one example that happens to have been very recent, but you have stuff like that happening all the time, and it's impossible for most people to keep up with it. So I think they're irrational when they just throw their hands up in the air and say, you know, I guess Trump and Putin did something, and he's a traitor, and, you know, that the Democrats are right, and the FBI is good now, and the intelligence services are, you know, noble. I mean, it's really such a mishmash of crap that to expect the average person to sift through it is almost not reasonable.
Also, I think the average person has a view of politics that's untethered to reality. Like, I used to think, when, you know, you grow up as a kid, you have this idea of, well, these guys are elected, they're going to office, they're representing us, and they're fighting for our best interests. And, you know, the government, now granted, this idea of politics, an idea of government and everything else kind of misses the fact that most people hate the government. Like, they hate this idea. When you ask polls about what they think of the parties, you know, it's like 30%, some insane degree where it's like, no, we don't like these people. No, they don't represent us. But they will be shocked to find out that, how can I say this? There's this air of about it, or let's say it this way. Mainstream media presents it as if these guys are noble people fighting for the best interests of the politics of the society itself. And I'm saying that's nonsense. That's not necessarily the way these guys go about their political affairs. Meaning, bringing up an issue about Russia to this degree and having the media hold on to this issue to this degree gives them this idea that there's a reality to this, or that there's more of a reality to it than there is a reality to it. So if you talk to the public may say, you know, like if I talk to any of my family members, they would think this is a real big issue. When you get into the details, like you say, they lose the thread, they miss it, they get the narrative, they lose the details.
And again, I think they just assume that it's a big deal because of the extremely high volume of information coming at them. Even though when you hone in on any one particular piece of information, it tends to not hold up to scrutiny.
Yeah.
So, but they don't have the effort. They don't want to make the effort, or they don't have the desire to actually scrutinize every individual piece of information. So they make the inference that because there's such a high volume of it coming at such a frequent rate, that it all adds up to a certain conclusion, which I think is justified, but is justified even if it's irrational, if that makes sense. And
yes, and so let's get into the rationality of what they're arguing. So what is the basis of the indictment? So they're trying to say that Russia hacked us in some way, or Russia attempted to hack us, or Russia took actions in order to attack or to phish or to whatever. What's the basis of this indictment?
Well, the basis of the indictment actually hasn't been forthcoming. I mean, they don't actually. An indictment is a series of assertions by the government that a grand jury has signed off upon because in a closed setting, they've purportedly been presented with evidence that supports the government's assertions.
Okay.
But that evidence has not been made available for public scrutiny, which is the critical aspect, because there's also very little expectation on the part of the prosecutors, meaning the Mueller team, that the evidence will ever have to be publicly scrutinized, because it's almost a foregone conclusion that these Russian intelligence officers are ever going to show up in an American court. I mean, it's preposterous that is actually something that could ever happen. I mean, you don't want to absolutely rule out the possibility. I mean, I guess anything is possible, but like a common sense view on that leads one to believe that it will never happen. So that means the evidence will never be publicly presented. And, you know, and they get into such specific detail that you'd think that they have corroborative evidence for these claims that maybe could even be released in some other capacity, you know, maybe once Mueller issues his full report, or whenever that happens. I don't know exactly, but the thing is, people can't suspend their skepticism of law enforcement claims simply because those claims seem to advance a narrative that they've become invested in.
Yes.
And that applies to, you know, remember when, I'm thinking back now to Ferguson in 2014 when the grand jury didn't indict Darren Wilson, remember that? Mm-hmm. And almost nobody who is a sensible person then would have said, okay, because the prosecutor at that point said that there weren't sufficient grounds to charge Darren Wilson, that means Darren Wilson didn't do anything wrong. That means Darren Wilson is exonerated in a moral sense. That means all the facts have been fairly established here. No, because we have a healthy skepticism of law enforcement authorities and their motives and the incentives under which they operate. We marshal high skepticism about how they conduct themselves. And that would be just common sense, conventional wisdom in a lot of other contexts, but not in this one. Because in this context, people have vested their hopes in a particular law enforcement figure, Robert Mueller and his team of prosecutors, to, I don't know, save democracy from implosion. So they've thrown not just their journalistic standards out the window, they've thrown their ordinary expected skepticism of law enforcement into the garbage can as well, which is, to me, is even more offensive, because if any government official deserves extreme skepticism, it's generally people in the law enforcement arena, whether that be local police or federal, the highest echelons of federal prosecutors. But it all goes back to this notion that, you know, the whole Russiagate narrative requires the forfeiture of critical faculties, and that to me, I think, is what it's almost most offensive.
You know, what's offensive to me? There are two parts. It's that you're right, where you have to kind of suspend. Look, it's like saying human beings, you know, that guy over there is breathing. Yes, that guy's breathing, but so is that guy and that guy and that guy. Can we be honest and say that the United States also has a cyber weapons cache, and that cyber weapons cache has been used to attack all of the nations? And so it's a little rich to turn around and scream, "Oh my God, I was touched inappropriately."
Do people remember what Edward Snowden revealed, or is that ancient history now? I mean, people talk about Trump going to Europe and being overly aggressive with like Germany and other EU member states, but under Obama, the National Security Agency spied on the personal phone of Angela Merkel. And then Obama went to Germany and said, "Hey, it's still a little silly that you're upset about this because we all know that all states spy on one another."
Yes, right. That's my point.
That was 2013. That was 5 years ago or so. I mean, that wasn't the Middle Ages. So I think this idea that only now are we in this posture where we have any information about
gambling and establishment. Yeah.
It's
like, so the guy's over there gambling.
Yeah. So. Go ahead.
No. I'm sorry. I'm interrupting. There's a slight lag on my part, so sometimes I hear luft in it. I'm sorry. Go for it.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think bugging the personal phone of the German chancellor maybe is if in terms of statecraft and how statecraft is used to influence foreign affairs. I think that's probably a little bit more of an egregious offense than sending a spear phishing link to the Gmail account of a Democratic operative. So one thing, one had a thought experiment that I've used since 2016 when all this came out, and I went back and read one of my blog posts from December of 2016, and I tweeted it out recently. Was I wanted to say to myself, okay, let's just stipulate, for the sake of argument, that it's conclusively proven that it was the Russian state apparatus who are responsible for the quote hacking of John Podesta's Gmail account and the quote hacking of the Democratic National Committee and their email accounts. Okay, so we don't have a 100% conclusive evidence of that even now, notwithstanding the indictment, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say that that is the case. What were the fruits of that supposed interference? Well, the fruits of that supposed interference were the American public received vital information about some of the country's most powerful political actors, namely Hillary Clinton, John Podesta, Bill Clinton, many others, Haim Saban. And you can give multiple examples of the stuff that came out of those email leaks, which were reported on universally by the American press.
Yeah.
But now, in terms of how it's seen retrospectively, because Democratic partisans have been out front in leading the charge on this, they say that those email leaks or those email releases were nothing but just petty, trivial nonsense that was designed to undermine Hillary Clinton and attack America. Well, no. In addition to that, we got very important information that otherwise would have been concealed. Remember Hillary Clinton's speech transcripts, which she said that she would look into releasing at a debate with Bernie Sanders during the Democratic primary. Those never came out until John Podesta's emails were, hacked or spearphished or whatever. Yeah. So we got those in which she, basically reiterated her call for a no-fly zone in Syria, and she said all kinds of other stuff. She flattered Goldman Sachs. She said a lot of stuff that it was in the public interest to be aware of. We got information about how the State Department had merged operations with the Clinton Foundation in direct contravention of what Bill and Hillary and all their supporters have said had said was the case up until that point. We got remember the famous Donna Brazile episode where she intervened in a debate to basically help Hillary, and she had to resign from CNN. The entire Democratic National Committee Executive Committee had to resign in disgrace because of their behavior behind closed doors, so to say. We got exposure of malfeasance at the Clinton Foundation that would have never come out.
I mean, that was these words. I think that was illegal anyway, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
Probably, but all these were reported on at the time, and they were hailed as significant contributions to the public understanding of how its politicians operate behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And yet now, less than a year and a half afterwards, now it's just an attack on America, which put us all in danger and put us in thrall to a hostile foreign state. Well, okay, let's say it was Russia. what they did ultimately was they provided information to voters about their the most powerful political figures in the country, and they hacked, quote, the ruling party of that country, and who should have known that their online activity was going to be subject to, you know, hostile, probing every single day. So I just don't buy that, you know, John Podesta clicking on a spear phishing link and revealing noteworthy information to the American public is necessarily tantamount to a, quote, attack on America in the way that it's being portrayed now.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, they're acting like it's 9/11. They're, you know, so he's an appeaser, acting like the guy is Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain, yeah. Yeah, Neville Chamberlain. They're acting as if, you know, these people are, they're raising this to a level of hysteria that I don't think I've witnessed before. And it's done so when we get to the bare bones of it, a spear phishing of John Podesta, who, as you said, should have been known, saying he's one of the leading, you know, rulers of this country, if you want to say from the standpoint of the party apparatus. He should have known. We do it constantly. I mean, God damn it. It's so weird to me.
But the U.S. does it constantly, but the U.S. doesn't do it in furtherance of, you know, the right of the public to have that information for themselves. You know, so this quote hostile Russian attack resulted in the information becoming public, and then the American voters could draw their own conclusion, and American media outlets could report on it. You know, that is a lot different than, you know, attacking a country, taking their information for ourselves, and not revealing it, you know, in the public interest. So that's also a distinction.
Something, yeah. Let me ask you this. So from the standpoint of journalists, why? Like, I understand from the standpoint of political leaders. So I get it. When Schiff goes out there and Schiff is pushing this narrative that, you know, democracy has been attacked. I think, personally, I think this is extremely dangerous. We're becoming antagonistic towards a foreign country that has nuclear weapons. I think I heard 90% of the nuclear weapons on the planet are between these two countries. And you have a faction of the country for political ends that is screaming at the height of their lungs that we've been attacked. Now, even if they're in on it, the public is going to pick this up. There are going to be elements of the public that pick this up. I have a friend of mine who's a Hillary supporter who I haven't talked to in a while because he's saying we're at war. Like, this is the language that these people are involved in. It's utterly amazing. I get the political reasons. What are the journalistic reasons?
Well, you know, oddly enough, I think the journalistic reasons are similar to the political reasons, and they probably shouldn't be. But because of the mindset that's enveloped the media and political class, that rationale is actually a lot more similar for the respective, you know, cohorts of the class than you might want to think is the case. And I think a lot of it is to do with this notion of some apocalyptic collapse of the world order being upon us. It's almost an international issue. You know, Trump and Brexit were kind of perceived as very similar phenomenons.
Yeah.
And they kind of elevated journalists and politicians, who, again, are in large part comrades, into this kind of civilizational, epical drama that they are, you know, players in. And that's kind of an emboldening concept that, you know, you're on the cusp of history. You're watching this kind of shift in the kind of the international order unfold before our eyes, and it's up to you to stand up and say something that can avert, you know, this kind of civilizational collapse. So if you're kind of imbued with that level of grandiosity, it gives what you're doing extra importance in your own eyes, and it makes you much more self-important. That's why you have, you know, people like Jim Acosta, who's one of, you know, just a typical TV journalist star, being portrayed as a heroic defender of democracy when he's just a CNN guy who's like doing the same old CNN shtick and pretending as though he's like a martyr. Yeah. So I think it gives both journalists and politicians a sense that they are, you know, locked into this kind of civilizational combat narrative. And look at what the rhetoric just last week. I mean, that's why I feel like people are so fatigued, because it comes at them so constantly that they can't process it. Just less than a week ago, Trump went to Brussels for this NATO summit,
right?
And the most mainstream analysts in the entire American media were saying that this meeting represented a collapse of the international order. That was the conventional wisdom. I mean, I could rattle off examples, but I saved one of Max Fisher, who's like a writer for the New York Times, saying that we're on the cusp of a collapse of the Western security order as a result of this meeting. And then what was the actual result of the meeting? Well, the result was Trump basically got the NATO member states to reiterate their commitment to increasing defense spending.
Right, 4%.
To 2%, and Trump said he would wish it to be 4%, but the 4% wish wasn't actually codified in anything. It was just a reiteration of what Obama had achieved in 2014 for parity in terms of the allocation of defense of GDP to defense spending, which has been a long-standing, totally mainstream U.S. ambition. And Trump doing that, notwithstanding his bluster, what does that actually do? In effect, it strengthens NATO as an institution. It doesn't diminish it. It says that even though Trump has like temperamental differences from his predecessors, he's still willing to flatter all the NATO member states and affirm his commitment to what NATO stands for as an international institution. And he didn't withdraw from NATO. He didn't even threaten to withdraw from NATO. He wanted them to spend more money on entrenching NATO. Yeah. So, which is a weird dynamic, because Trump's opponents want to portray him as this cataclysmic change agent who's upending the world order, and then his supporters also, at least some of them, want to do something similar, where they're saying Trump is this bulwark against globalism. But what did he do? He, said a few incendiary comments, which he does every single day, and nothing. And the status quo was further entrenched.
Yes.
So there's kind of a confluence in terms of his opponents and supporters wanting to believe that he's a bigger departure from ordinary American politics than he really is, which kind of leads to this polarized atmosphere where you have the most extreme interpretation of events coming from both sides, and neither really bears much resemblance to reality.
Yeah, I look at Trump as being status quo. Like you said, he went to NATO. He tried to browbeat them to get them to spend more money. Hey, and we want you to buy more armaments. I think 58% of the military weapons that are bought from us. He's, hey, buy more of our weapons. Buy more of our weapons. Okay. He browbeat them on a few items. He's pushing them about Russia. Fair enough. He's making somewhat of a good point to Germany about Russia. How on earth are you saying you need NATO help while at the same token being allies with this country? If they're that much of a threat, why are you doing deals with this country that is such a threat to him?
Yeah, Trump is a departure from the status quo, but the main way in which he's a departure is rhetorically.
It's just tone.
And temperamentally and interpersonally.
Yeah.
Which is...
But that's different than in real world, tangible differences.
Right.
They cast him that way because they want to make him seem radical. It's like Democrats want him to make this radical departure. But I guess what I'm getting at is media, to some degree, has agreed with it. It's almost as if they've agreed with the Democratic interpretation and ran with it. Is this part of the reason why they believe they're in this epic struggle to save reality or save humanity, if you want to say it that way? Because the I'm saying this poorly, but Democrats have interpreted the Trump thing in a particular way. This is a Trump phenomena. The world order is being upended. He's taking, he's going to eat babies and kick puppies. And the media says, oh my God, they're right. And one story after the next have led into this thing of this maniac is working with a foreign actor to upend democracy. And that's the narrative that they've pushed. I mean, it seems like that's the narrative they've agreed with, and that's the narrative that they've ran with. Everything is coded in these terms, whether it's him going to talk to Putin, you should hear some of the stuff they're saying about it, or whether it's him trying to get troops out of NATO, troops out of Syria. Everything is coded in the lens of Donald Trump is a Putin puppet, and they completely ignore some of the things that he's doing that's antagonistic towards Russia. He misses it. He misses it. Like, good.
That's the fact that the stuff that he's done that's antagonistic to Russia is so totally ignored. It's just an amazing example to me of the power of narrative, which is what we've been talking about from the beginning. I mean, you could easily construct a narrative which is the diametric opposite of what the conventional was now in mainstream media, using actual action that Trump has undertook. I mean, he's bombed Putin's chief client state in the Middle East on 2 separate occasions. And then I hear, conspiracy theories about, Putin wanted that. Putin welcomed his client state being bombed. It was that was all part of the conspiracy. So, I mean, even dropping bombs doesn't falsify the theory, which tells you that nothing will. Trump reiterated his commitment to NATO. He's elevated anti-Russia hawks into key positions in his cabinet. He sent lethal arms to Ukraine, which even Obama didn't do.
He's giving them the fascists, by the way.
Yeah, the list goes on, and all that stuff is bad. I think Trump ought not to have done that, nor should any president. But the fact that somehow can even get construed as further evidence of this fundamental Trump-Russia conspiracy theory just shows that that's what it at its core is, a conspiracy theory. But a conspiracy theory is never depicted as such when it originates in mainstream circles. It's only called a conspiracy theory when it starts at the fringes and then maybe trickles inward into the center. But when it starts in the center, it's never a conspiracy theory.
Well, yeah.
Saddam and Al-Qaeda being in cahoots wasn't a conspiracy theory because that came from the New Yorker and Dick Cheney. And Trump and Russia having this plot to undermine the world order isn't a conspiracy theory because it comes from the think tanks and it came from all the Hillary acolytes. And it's the same story over and over again. But the thing is, people aren't aware of it because they have such a distrust and dislike of Trump for, in large part, legitimate reasons, but it overwhelms their critical faculties in a way that I think has really been damaging for just the national psyche.
Right there. I think that's where it is. I think this guy, his tone is missing. Is like I think his tone is so over the top. We really hate this guy. So anything that they can pin on him, they pin on him. I think that's the way it comes in. It makes it easy to hit him just because of who he is, not necessarily, missing whether it's true. The reality of it matters less. This is, political theater to some degree. Let me ask you this. I think part of the problem is we take an American perspective, or the media journalists take an American perspective as opposed to just what's true. If I was sitting on the moon looking at events, what would be more true than not? As opposed to I am in a country and I'm taking the best disposition of the country itself, even when the disposition is not necessarily the most accurate. What I mean by this is the mechanism that they're using to be outraged by this is that something happened to us. We've been attacked. We've been besmirched. Something has taken place that has unraveled democracy in this country. We've, in the last 8 years, have destroyed countries. Like, I find that perspective to be amazing, that it can even be uttered with a straight face. They are literally on the media today screeching about this, screeching about Donald Trump meeting Putin and all this other stuff because we've been attacked. How on earth, when you're in the media and you've talked to other journalists, when you're having these conversations with other journalists, I get the impression that you more so take the perspective of if you're sitting on the moon looking at the world and you're trying to become, what is the more objective perspective as opposed to what is the American perspective of events? What are the conversations like behind the scenes? And it doesn't make sense. I'm hoping I'm asking this question in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I increasingly feel like I have less and less affinity with fellow journalists, to be frank, because it seems as though there's such a divergence in how to best depict current events. I mean, that's in a very fundamental way that kind of leads me to be just every single day more and more suspicious of journalists as a class.
Yes. Okay.
And
so
I don't, and even though I've practiced journalism and do practice journalism and commentary, I try to set myself apart from journalists as a class. And a lot of journalists don't even recognize that they're part of a class, which is part of like the self-awareness problem. And that's something that I've, written about pretty regularly, even predating Trump. I was going to make a point now. The sitting on the moon and looking at Earth, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that this kind of quote attack, spear phishing a Gmail account, can be cast in such cataclysmic terms.
They said it was a weapon. They said it was a weapon. They said they weaponized truth.
They say it's an attack on America. I mean, by the way that they actually put it, it could justify the invocation of Article 5 of the NATO Treaty.
I've said that.
Because you know, according to the Mueller indictment, the GRU, which is the military intelligence wing of the Russian state, was responsible for these email hacks. And you could very easily make an argument that that constitutes an armed attack as per the guidelines of the NATO Treaty, which would require, you know, an active war posture between all of Western Europe, America, and Canada against the and not just Western Europe, also elements of Eastern Europe now against Russia. And so that kind of tells you, you know, they probably don't believe their own rhetoric if they're not willing to go that far. They're using the word attack and undermining democracy and that kind of thing for just kind of rhetorical effect.
Yeah.
But again, as to the point of sitting on the moon and looking at Earth, the fact that Podesta having his emails exfiltrated could be put in such histrionic terms kind of gives you an insight into the basic fragility of the American empire. I mean, they look at that as in such as such a wildly disproportionate event, but America abetting the total destruction of Yemen for 3 years and causing historic famine, basically just destroying Yemen society for future generations. I mean, children who are malnourished, suffering from malnourished, are going to have impaired cognitive development their entire lives. Many of them might even end up being, quote, radicalized and want to join some kind of group which seeks vengeance against the United States and Saudi Arabia for their role in this. I mean, you have countless examples of stuff like that going on. I mean, America has been at war in Afghanistan now for like almost 2 decades, and they can't even hold back a group of like guerrilla fighters from seizing territory. It's so wildly out of whack in terms of the proportionality that the only conclusion that one can draw if you're sitting on the moon looking at Earth is that this particular imperial state is on the decline. And it's fostering paranoia within its elite classes as a means of distraction from that fundamental reality, which is that its power is declining. Trump is a manifestation of that. The political discord that is a manifestation of that. The herd mentality of the media is a manifestation of that. And to me, that, like, I always try to think of things in a longer perspective when I get kind of overwhelmed and frustrated by the day-to-day politics. And to me, that's the explanation that I always go back to, and it seems to make the most sense.
Wow. Yeah, I feel you. This issue has been, I think it's always weird. I look at this and I said to myself, just looking at this, the most enraging aspect of it is seeing the herd mentality as people go along with it, not questioning it at all. And that's why I wanted you on the show, because you were one of those people who were questioning this from the beginning. Like, it's like, wait a minute. I mean, do we really know this? And yes, Donald Trump is a horrible person, but him being horrible doesn't necessarily mean that he's done X. And by the way, they've moved away from Trump and Russia collusion. They've just jumped the shark completely. I mean, if people remember, this started as Donald Trump worked with Trump to hack the DNC. That was the original premise of, and we so far away from that particular premise. Michael Tracey, thank you very much for coming on the show, man. I really do appreciate this.
I enjoyed it.
By the way, I always ask, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we finish this? I mean, I'm trying to think, is there anything else I need to ask? But is there anything else?
I guess, ironically enough, we didn't really talk a whole lot about the actual summit meeting today, which is called the latest freakout. But it all kind of plays into the same stuff. I mean, I think, I just watched it. Of course, the big takeaway is that Trump is evincing his treason once more. And what's amazing to me is that the main progenitors of that narrative, meaning that Trump has committed treason and everything he does can be understood in reference to his having committed treason, the main progenitors of that narrative tend to be people who would otherwise consider themselves progressives and who have a kinship with people in the media who maybe don't overtly declare themselves progressives, but, you know, are in the sort of liberal media class, you know, not in the way that right-wingers tend to put it, but there's some truth there.
Let me ask you this. In that collusion between those two things, I mean, so I haven't watched it yet. I haven't watched the two things, but I have heard people's commentary on it where, like you said, Trump has just committed treason. I saw John McCain's commentary on it. John McCain in and of itself, John McCain giving this commentary essentially that lends up to similar things. This Trump, I've never seen a president act this particular way or debase himself. Yeah. It's 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. Like, I don't understand their perspective on this. Is it that you're not supposed to talk to people who you consider to be your adversaries?
Their perspective is that they are so hung up on domestic political disputes that they have a fundamental inability to separate themselves from that domestic narrative and to look at a broader view. I mean, that I think accounts for it, because if you're somebody, you know, if you are, you know, if you're in Costa Rica or you're in Switzerland or you're in Mongolia or somewhere and you're looking at Trump and Putin meeting, you're saying to yourself, most likely, this is a meeting of the two main nuclear powers who have had strained tensions, and them attempting to achieve some kind of diplomatic accord is beneficial for humanity.
Yeah.
But if you're sitting in New York or California and you're, you know, a member of one of these, you know, elite political / media classes, your perspective is diametrically opposite, where you're saying this is horrible because this is more evidence of our president colluding with his, you know, nefarious foreign benefactor.
Do you think
so? The fact that there's such a disparity there, I mean, I think if we had a more self-aware political / media class, would make them sort of second guess themselves, but we don't have that. So they don't second guess themselves, and they just keep going and going and going, and it gets progressively worse every day.
Do they believe it, or do you think they're? I always end up in this thing: are they incompetent or are they lying?
You know, it depends. It depends on the individual.
Just so I'm clear, I don't mean it to be that harsh on this very specific issue, and this is kind of goes to what I'm getting at. But do they believe it? Like, are they when are they really this hysterical? Are they this hysterical for political effect? Are they political actors to such a degree where they are acting in a political way and they don't realize they're acting in a political way, or are they doing this intentionally?
You know, I think it depends on the individual. I think if you were to speak to any one of them and, you know, sit down for 45 minutes over coffee, you'd probably come to a point of like semi-mutual agreement about how, you know, maybe aspects of this have been overwrought, but there are some reasons for suspicion, you know, the kind of just basic middle ground that people tend to come to. But it's not about the behavior or conduct of any one individual. It's about how they function as a group. And as a group, this is the kind of atmosphere that they've fostered. And it also means that no one individual has personal culpability for it, so they can kind of pass off the blame just onto this amorphous blob, which constitutes the media and the political class, which is, you know, a very, you know, dispersed kind of entity. And it means so that's why there's never any accountability, because, you know, a certain individual can always sound reasonable in relation to what the broader climate, but there's no like maintainer of the broader climate who you can, you know, hold accountable.
It's not like a McCarthy, like this one guy, you know, propagate, or you go back and point to this one guy. It's a bunch of people who, for the most part, have lumped themselves into a particular narrative because that narrative attacks a person that they absolutely hate, and they're okay with it.
Because they don't want to expend the professional and personal capital that would require to actively combat the narrative, because
pushing against,
as I'm sure you know, and as I well know, all too well, is that if you do expend that capital, it evaporates pretty quickly, because you automatically get described as a stooge of both Putin and Trump, and you get called a closeted right winger. You get called somebody who has a kinship with the alt-right. Yeah. The attacks go on forever, and it can have real consequences. So I don't think most people have the ability in the circles that they operate in to actually be forceful about that. And it's amazing to me because I can't recall an issue where the ostracization, the ostracism has been as potent and pervasive as this one, because of just the overweening figure of Trump, and how dominant he is, and how everybody perceives the world now, and because this Russia issue is seen as just the doorway into how Trump became a political force. Yeah. If you stand in that doorway and try to like urge people not to come in, then you're abetting this worldwide fascist takeover, and it really has produced a level of ostracization that I think is somewhat unprecedented, at least in my own experience. And I don't mean to say that I'm a martyr of any kind or that I'm a victim at all. I'm just observing the potency of how this kind of social sanction has worked, and it really is extremely potent. And I think that's why you see such a pervasive conformity within much of the media and political class.
I'm curious, has this adversely affected you professionally? I mean, I know for the most part we're talking about Russia, but since you brought up this kind of ostracization that takes place in the media over this issue, kind of almost like a blacklisting of sorts, people choosing their sides, has this affected you? I mean, you're a journalist. You've been in the media for God knows how long.
I don't have hard evidence to say that it's been adverse, but I think just in terms of perception, probably. Again, in the grand scheme of things, it's definitely not a huge hindrance. So I'm not going to dwell on it, but I do think that it has an effect over time that can be corrosive to your journalistic standing, even if you have a good faith commitment to the views that I've tried to expound here. It always can be turned into some kind of that you have some kind of you have ulterior motives, and then you want to help Trump in some kind of underhanded way, which is not the case. In fact, I think this kind of mythology that has come about is a big impediment to providing an effective counterweight to Trump. So I don't I'm fine, obviously, but I think it does have that kind of socially corrosive effect over time.
I do think if depending on where you're trying to go, people like in the United States, people talk about journalists and they say, well, I get to say whatever I want. And it's like, yeah, but what do you say? It's like, yeah, you may get to say whatever you want, but what is the thing that you're saying? If I'm choosing, if I was getting somebody for a job and I wanted somebody to do a particular task that's on my particular channel, I wouldn't hire somebody who's a right winger. I just wouldn't. It would make sense for me if I'm trying to get somebody to edit videos who doesn't have a perspective that's similar to my own. I would imagine the same thing with mainstream news, just like CNN or Fox. Fox is hiring Hannity because they know Hannity is going to say out of his mouth when they put Hannity on that channel. I think the same thing with Chuck Todd. I think the same thing with Tapper, all of them. Now, they may be their own people. They may have their own disposition. But what is the disposition? The disposition is putting out a particular narrative. Am I right on that? That just seems to be my perspective of the media. The media, it's not that I think they're wrong people or bad people. I think they have a certain narrative that they're espousing for the channel and that the channel is okay with them espousing. Like Ed Schultz, great example. Ed Schultz said they didn't want him covering with Sanders. Said that he think that they disliked the fact that he was covering Bernie Sanders. In some cases, actively stopped him from covering Bernie Sanders, and even goes further and say part of the reason they think they cut him from the channel was Sanders. Now,
yeah, I think you're right in the sense that although journalists have a vaunted First Amendment right to say whatever they please, other than things that are defamatory, and the standard for defamation is pretty narrow in the United States, but having a legal freedom to say things is not the same as having the social mandate to say things that are often required in order to have a platform within media precincts. In fact, the censure that can arise as a result of that kind of social pressure is often more stifling than any kind of legal prohibition. And I think we can go around celebrating how great the First Amendment is, and I think it is, compared to how most political how most societies treat their journalists. I think it is something to be vaunted, but at the same time, the ubiquity of social censure again is a conformity enforcing device, and that, I think, on a practical level can be even much more impactful than any kind of legal stricture that some government official might impose.
And do you think that's what's taking place with this? Meaning people understand we need to toe a particular line?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, because the worst thing that you can be portrayed as in the media is a Trump supporter,
or conspiracy theories,
or conspiracy theorists, or usually they're now they're kind of one and the same in a lot of ways.
Well, the wild part about it is I look at this stuff as relative. Like the perspective that I put out is somewhat relative to the perspective that somebody else puts out, et cetera, with the exception of how it lines up with the objective evidence. Meaning something took place somewhere in the world. How does my perspective line up with what took place in the world? It's one thing when it's hard. It's not. It's one of those things where they don't know, and yet they still say they know. That's the problem. It's they take this perspective of as if what they're saying is to some degree the word of God. And anything else that comes beyond that perspective is somehow wrong or off, missing the point that what they're saying is just the perspective of events. Like you said, they're the bellwether. Everything else is the conspiracy theories, and that's somewhat problematic. I agree with you. I totally agree with you on that. So again, let me ask you this: what's next? I mean, you left TYT. What's on the agenda? I got to ask about something. You can say no, you don't if you don't want to answer. Your ending post, you said it was an interesting experience. What do you mean by interesting experience? That's a yada yada. And I often find that when people yada yada, it's like, I was at the club and we, yada yada, we got home. You find out you got wasted, had coke on the ass of some prostitute in Vegas and slashed the car. Like what's interesting experience means in this case?
I mean, I really just meant that it was an interesting experience. There's not a whole lot to read into it. I just, not a whole lot. It was something that I was able to be involved in for length of. I mean, this is going to sound vague, but it's not meant to. It was an interesting experience. That's it. I mean, it was good in a lot of ways. I got a lot of. I did some work that I stand by for sure.
Yeah.
And. Oh, that's about it. I mean, I understand that maybe that seemed a little ambiguous, but I really just meant that it was an interesting experience.
Like, what the hell does that mean? What's yada yadaing on it?
Yeah.
All right. Very cool. In
terms of what's next, I mean, it's only been a little while since I departed formally, so I'm in the process of coming up with other things. It would be premature to talk about in detail at this point, but obviously I want to continue doing journalism and commentary and trying to provide the perspective that I'm able to provide. So there will be more of that in the future, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, man. I would like to see more of that in the future. I'm saying that. And part of the reason I followed you on Twitter for God knows how long. And I've even followed you on TYT for God knows how long. So I absolutely appreciated your perspective on TYT, and I don't want you to go anywhere. So I want you to remain somewhere where your voice is out and where you're talking and you're looking into the camera and giving a perspective or giving your stories. I've always appreciated your perspective, even going back on Vice. I remember even on Vice. So thank you very much for coming on to the show. I really appreciate it. Well, it's been about an hour. I really appreciate you coming on. I have this bad habit of keeping people ridiculous amounts of time. I remember one guy was like 3 hours, and people joke me for having people on for like stuff like that.
I've done the same thing in the past, so we have similar habits. But, I appreciate the discussion as well, and keep on trucking.
I know, right? All right, let me see. We have Jamal. When people call you Putin puppet or closet right wing, it's like Bill O'Reilly saying you're right. You are against the troops if you're against the war in Iraq. Yeah, it is. That's a good point. This is Krillin 876. When people say you're right wing, it's like Bill O'Reilly saying you're against the troops because you're against the war in Iraq.
Yeah.
about the same. Sclazy libertarian for all, hashtag go vegan. Krillin, in my opinion, the biggest story should be Puerto Rican deaths underreported. Yes.
Reasonable.
Yes, absolutely. Bold like a leopard. Talk about John Matt Fouls equals the truth. So the Matt Fouls has to do with this guy named Matt comes on Rachel Maddow and says that the Bernie Sanders Facebook groups were infested with Russians. I don't know if you remember this. And Rachel Maddow brings the guy on the show. Comes to find out the guy wasn't in charge of that Facebook group at all. The guy was some kind of Democratic operative. The people who actually did own the group ends up confronting the guy, who, to which point the rest of the Democrats are calling him like Putin puppets and, get out of the rally. There's it's a bunch of weirdness associated with it, but essentially the guy wasn't who he said he was. Maddow didn't care that the guy wasn't who he said he was, because after all, Russia, Putin, attack on democracy, and all that other stuff. Yeah, so it's amazing. All right, I'm going to end this here. Dude, thank you very much for coming on. Guys, thank you all very much. This is Tracey. Jesus Christ, your name slipped from me at the very last moment. Tracey. Give me your first name. I'm sorry.
You got my last name, so that's good enough.
No, it's not good enough. It just slipped my mind at the last minute.
I kind of want to leave everybody in suspense if they want.
I don't want to leave people in suspense. Tracey, Michael Tracey. Jesus Christ. I'm sitting here. I'm like, Matt. Have you ever tried to go to the ATM machine and you, for whatever reason, started putting in a number? Somebody else gave you a number, and a number was similar to your own, and it starts screwing with you when you try to enter your number to the ATM machine because the other number is conflicting. That's kind of how it works. Michael Tracey, formerly of TYT, journalist, Vice News. He will be back. You'll be seeing him soon. Michael Tracey, thank you very much, man. I appreciate it.
All right, take care.
All right, guys.